Okay, so where we last left off, we were talking a little bit about how there are some different factors that help improve the interface between humans and computers. And as we're kind of seeing in our current world, being able to use computers is a pretty critical skill that you have to be able to know. So now let's talk about a few other factors that can help improve that understanding beyond training. So, system design becomes really important. The computer or its software needs to be sufficiently usable. So, one of the things that sometimes makes certain types of programming difficult is that some of the languages have a really steep learning curve, and there's not always a lot of information out there to help you really learn that from a beginner's perspective. So I like things like Codecademy that are really helpful in that regard. Yes, I do. I accidentally hit my cat. I didn't know he was back there. But for something like R, which is often used, the learning curve for that is actually pretty steep unless you know somebody who is capable of sharing their code with you. So, computers or its software need to be sufficiently usable. Now, computers do not work the way that humans work to try to reach a solution. And you have to understand that, but at the same time, what's really critical is that a computer program or a computer, to be sufficiently usable, has to represent the problems in a way that a person would. And generally, if you have to learn how to change that representation, it's going to be harder for you to use. Here's a really, really simple example. So, yeah, I'm kind of an old. I did not have a cell phone until I was about 23. And if y'all can imagine it, when I was in high school, and if I needed a ride from my mom, I had to find like a couple of quarters for a payphone or have a calling card on hand. But some of the older cell phones that you look at usually do a pretty good job of representing the different materials or the different types of apps on the phone with a picture that makes it really easy to understand. So for a camera, looks like a camera. Our phone book kind of looks like an ID card. Our email looks like an envelope. Our call log looks like a phone. Our radio looks like a radio. The internet looks like the world because it's the World Wide Web. So this is pretty intuitive. Now compare that to the kind of interfaces that we see today. So what you're looking at here is a cell phone interface for an Android phone and a cell phone interface for an iPhone. And in general, some of these are pretty intuitive. Some of them are a little less intuitive. So for example, well, a calendar makes a lot of sense. The camera makes a lot of sense. The clock makes a lot of sense. The maps make a lot of sense. The stock app makes a lot of sense. The iTunes store makes a lot of sense. So does the compass. But for something like settings, that's not very intuitive. That gear is only relevant for Apple products. And so some of these don't really look all that intuitive. The same is true on some level for the icons on the Android phone. So the YouTube actually works pretty well, as does Play Music, as does Gmail and the Maps. But Wallet, Authenticator, Play Movie kind of looks like a movie roll. Voicemail, that kind of works. Hangouts, some of these just don't seem as intuitive. So what's really critical when you're designing phones and especially applications, you want to make sure as much as possible that that icon makes sense. Some of these make a lot of sense. Some of these seem really intuitive. Other ones of these do not really look all that intuitive at all. Looking at you, settings, looking at you, authenticator. If you don't know what the Google Authenticator is, you're not going to get any idea of what it is based on its icon. Versus if I looked at this, well, I've probably got some idea that it's weather. What is helpful is that you'll always have these little lines of text below them that tell you what you're dealing with. If you didn't have those, this would be so much harder to navigate. And I would say that some of these icons are just bad because they don't feel intuitive or descriptive on a human level. Now, computers can also aid collective cooperation. So we're kind of seeing this right now in real time as more and more people kind of flock to Zoom. So what we're kind of seeing is an enhancement of computer-supported cooperative work, CSCW. So basically, people who are interested in these kind of ideas are interested in how technology can be used to help people collaborate and work together on various tasks. Now, there are going to be some differences compared to in-person interactions. So for example, so for my research methods class, usually I have collaboration in the form of peer review. Students will pass their hard copy papers over to another student in the classroom, and they will kind of review the article. Obviously, we can't do that anymore, so I'm trying to do that with something like Google Docs or with review capabilities on Word. So we have these kind of collaborative computer-based interactions. Generally, what we're going to find is that in general, people tend to be a little less inhibited on the internet. They're less likely to conform as well. And that's because there is that degree of remoteness that would not otherwise be there. But there is going to be greater difficulty in reaching a decision and greater problems coordinating with each other. Part of the reason why I did asynchronous teaching, I kind of thought that coordinating like 15 to 20 people to meet for a class would be more trouble than letting you work at your own pace. And that's just my opinion. So now let's talk briefly about organizational citizenship behaviors. We'll talk about what they are. I might have another lecture up that specifically focuses on organizational citizenship, but I did want to give you a brief overview of what it is. It is another type of productive workplace behavior, but it's a little bit different from productive workplace behavior because it's not specifically a part of the job that you were assigned to do. So organizational citizenship behavior, or OCB, is basically any sort of behavior that goes beyond the job task requirements but are generally beneficial to the organization. So you're basically being a good person. You're being a good citizen. So in the workplace, this might include punctuality. It might include assisting your supervisor with their work, giving advance notice for absences. Some examples of OCB that I often do include the kind of study sessions that I do for classes, creation of the study guides. These are things that are not technically in my job description. It is not required for me to actually give you a study guide, but I still like to. And by the way, I still will be giving you those for your exam. There are two major components of organizational citizenship behavior. There's altruism, which is doing something nice for somebody else, and compliance, going along with what somebody asks you to do. So what do we know about organizational citizenship behaviors? So just as job satisfaction does not make you necessarily a more productive worker, OCB also does not imply that you are that your job performance is good. We do know, however, that based on the data that higher levels of OCB do seem to improve productivity and the accuracy of performance. Now, whenever we talk about these types of organizational phenomena, the question becomes, what are the antecedents of these behaviors? So what causes people to engage in organizational citizenship behaviors? That will include things like higher job satisfaction. If you like your job more, you are going to be more likely to engage in OCB. If you have a very strong, effective commitment, if you're very emotionally attached to your organization, you will also see a greater likelihood of OCB. If you have a sense of justice, and if your supervisor relationships are generally good ones. Additionally, peer pressure can also lead to a greater adoption of organizational citizenship behaviors. If you belong in an organization where this kind of thing is the norm, you're going to be more likely to see those OCBs. So let's compare organizational citizenship behaviors that are individual focused versus organization focused. So OCBI is basically organizational citizenship behavior for the individual. That is focused more on helping employees and helping coworkers. Compare that to something like OCBO. So that's organizational citizenship behavior that is more focused on the organization. And one of the things that I kind of want to be clear, each of these is associated with different outcomes. Generally, helping your coworkers and employees will generally make you like a place more. Organizational citizenship that tends to focus on the organization more might lead to better productivity. But generally, we're going to find that OCB is not necessarily purely altruistic. And that's true for a lot of altruism. There's always possibly an element of wanting to do these behaviors because they make you feel good, because they make you look good. So it may not be a purely altruistic behavior. Okay. So now let's get to the really interesting part that I know y'all were waiting to get to, the part where this gets kind of a little bit dark. We're going to talk about counterproductive workplace behaviors. So as I kind of mentioned, workplace aggression and in particular workplace rage, things like postal employees basically these massive mass shootings, killing coworkers and things like that. These instances are incredibly rare. But that doesn't mean that other types of counterproductive work behaviors do not happen. There's a variety of different behaviors that are classified as CWBs, and any of them, and they're considered CWBs because they are either harming the organization itself or they're harming other people at work. And that covers a wide variety of different types of behaviors. That includes physical or verbal aggression, so like bullying, hostile behavior or inappropriate behavior towards your coworkers, destruction of property, purposely doing your work badly or failing to do it on purpose, or theft. All of these things either are going to hurt the organization or they're deliberately damaging your coworkers. And all of these are considered CWBs. So let's talk about a few in particular. We're going to talk about sabotage, aggression, and theft. So sabotage typically will occur when an employee either destroys property or deliberately withholds performance. So they deliberately don't do the work that they're supposed to do. So that can be considered a form of sabotage. And so this has both direct and indirect costs. So directly, it can cause property damage. Indirectly, it can cause a loss of productivity. Now, moreover, if you're seeing somebody engage in sabotage and they're not being appropriately censured or punished for their lack of work or for their sabotage, this may indirectly affect how you feel about your job, because if somebody is deliberately doing something that hurts the department or the organization or the division or things like that, if somebody is deliberately doing that and they're not getting punished for it, well, what kind of place am I working for? It may make people around them want to do their work a little less. Arson is one such example of sabotage. Most acts of sabotage, though, can be really, really hard to prove. So, for example, let's say that one act of sabotage that you do is you purposely do a bad job, either to hurt the organization or to get yourself fired or laid off. Now, that is technically a form of sabotage, but it's really hard to prove. If you're ignoring warning signals on equipment, you're putting either yourself or other people at risk, but you could potentially make the case it was an accident. I didn't read it right. That can be really hard to prove. Likewise, taking off a warning label on some equipment could be considered a form of sabotage, but it could also just be a case of the equipment was old and the label fell off. So sabotage can be really hard to prove because, well, you could easily see something like this happening, not because of a deliberate action, but because of gross negligence instead. Now, workplace theft. Generally, theft from work costs companies billions of dollars a year. That includes things like shoplifting, and there's a lot of data out there that shows that employees are far more likely to steal from their companies than shoplifters are, which is why yours truly finds it really funny that Walmart scans receipts. Now, having said that, most of these thefts, shrinkage, loss of product, those are caused by people within the organization rather than shoplifters. I just find that entertaining. And additionally, anytime that you're dealing with theft, there are resources. You're going to have to utilize resources to combat theft. You're going to have to do training. You're going to have to utilize money to hire loss prevention associates. You're going to have to use technology to try to control theft, and that costs money. So theft can be incredibly detrimental to an organization, not just because of loss of product, but because of all of the different actions that you'll have to take to curb that theft as well. One of the things that we can find, though, integrity tests, like we talked about earlier on in the semester, can be used to help assess honesty. Other workplaces have utilized lie detector tests. Take it from Dr. Gilchrist, lie detector tests are pretty iffy. And they may not actually be measuring somebody actually lying. So those are kind of iffy. So how common are counterproductive workplace behaviors? About 25% of people in a survey by Bennett and Robinson in 2000, 25% falsified a report to get reimbursed for money that wasn't actually spent. That actually happened in my lab when I was in graduate school. We had an undergraduate research assistant who had basically stopped showing up. To help us, and she was supposed to be getting paid to do this, and she would go and turn in a pay stub or a pay statement to my advisor. My advisor would sign the form, not knowing that she hadn't actually shown up to work, and that is technically a form of theft. You are lying about doing your job, but you're still getting the rewards when you didn't do any work. What we also see is about 1/3 played pranks on a fellow employee. So generally, Jim putting Dwight's stapler in the Jell-O is funny when it's on TV, but that could be considered a form of harassment or bullying in the real world. Somebody like Jim, who constantly plays pranks on Dwight, would probably not be in their workplace very long. The problem is that Michael Scott, as nice as he is an incompetent boss. And so a much more competent boss would probably have fired Jim a long time ago. 52% of workers took property without permission. 61% knowingly neglected to follow instructions. They deliberately did a bad job. 78% made fun of somebody at work. That will eventually come back to that person. And bullying at work is not illegal, but it is incredibly destructive and it hurts an organization. So how do CWBs happen? CWBs happen in a variety of different ways. Generally, stressful job conditions and constraints breed frustration. So one example of a constraint might be that nobody at your company has gotten a raise for a while. Times have been really hard. Maybe the company's coming out of a recession. Maybe the economy's not doing well. Nobody's gotten a raise in years. And that creates a sense of frustration. And additionally, if you're under stress, that is going to create frustration and dissatisfaction. Now, here's the thing about frustration. It can be an antecedent to really bad things. It can also be an antecedent to really good things. But remember how we talked about perceived control? How much control do you think you have over this situation? If you feel like you don't have a lot of control over this situation, frustration is going to manifest itself as these counterproductive work behaviors. You're going to see destructive behaviors. Here's what's interesting, though. Frustration can be an opportunity for growth. If you have a high sense of control, you're going to see people engaging in constructive behaviors that help better themselves. So you're going to see people working harder, seeking more training to try to get around that frustration and dissatisfaction that they feel. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, though, is that for all we know about CWBs, it's actually really hard to look at them. It's hard to get a good metric on them because most people are not going to admit to illegal behaviors unless there's an anonymous questionnaire. And this kind of goes back to ethics. We want people to be truthful, but we want to make sure as much as possible that there won't be negative repercussions for sharing that information. And so one of the ways that we can kind of protect employees from this is by making sure that their information is anonymously reported. So if somebody's done something illegal or something that is actively harmful to the company, we want to make sure that there won't be retaliation for that honesty. They should probably quit that behavior, but we don't necessarily want to punish them for reporting that in research. One thing that we do know, though, is that employees do report stressful conditions and injustice. Both of those can be antecedents to counterproductive work behaviors, so we want to kind of be on guard for those kind of situations. One of the other things that we know is that counterproductive work behaviors also do relate to personality traits in addition to stressful job conditions and organizational constraints. Individuals that are really high in trait anger are a lot more likely to commit counterproductive work behaviors. And generally, individuals that are low in the big 5 factor of agreeableness, conscientiousness, and emotional stability, that neuroticism, are also more likely to engage in CWB. So if you don't get along with other people, if you're not really very thoughtful and detailed and the type of person that's cautious and planning, and if you are low in that emotional stability, which means you're very highly neurotic, you're a lot more likely to engage in those counterproductive behaviors as a way of managing the frustration that you feel. So that's really all I had for counterproductive work behaviors. I might do an additional lecture on organizational citizenship behaviors, but other than that, that is what I have for you this week. I've added some really cool TED Talks to your playlist on YouTube. If you want, go ahead and check those out if you find those interesting, and feel free to share any that you find with me that you find interesting. Thanks so much, and I'll see you later.